This session is going to focus on advancing the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment through corporate responsibility. And I'm going to moderate the session today. My name is Georgina Lloyd, and I'm the Regional Coordinator of Environmental Law and Governance for UNEP Asia Pacific. So I wanted to start the discussion today by kind of dissecting the title that we have on the screen. What exactly is the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment that should be advanced by business? And many of us are familiar with the fact that, of course, the UN General Assembly in 2022 recognized the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. 161 member states voted in favor of this resolution. And at the core of this right is a bundle of substantive and procedural rights. They connect nature and preventing climate change and pollution with respecting, promoting, and fulfilling human rights. They support coordinated, integrated, and non-discriminatory responses to the triple planetary crisis for healthier people and ecosystems. Evolving substantive elements of this right include clean air, safe and sufficient water, healthy and sustainably produced food, non-toxic environments, healthy ecosystems and biodiversity, and a safe and stable climate. The procedural elements include access to environmental information, public participation in environmental decision-making, and access to justice and remedy. The UNGA resolution, the General Assembly resolution, called upon stakeholders, including businesses, to adopt policies to enhance cooperation, to strengthen capacity building, and to continue to share good practices in order to scale up efforts to ensure a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment for all. In many cases, business operations are going to intersect with the right to a healthy environment, including those throughout supply chains and contractual relationships. Business interactions, practices, and policies can either uphold environmental safeguards and protect a healthy environment, or they can result in environmental harms and impact the procedural rights of affected communities. In other words, they can potentially violate the right to a healthy environment. But what obligations do businesses have then to act to uphold and respect environmental rights? Well, recent developments, such as the International Court of Justice Advisory Opinion on Climate Change, clarify the obligations of states, including the duty to prevent significant harm to the environment, including acting with due diligence. And states, of course, are expected to regulate the private sector in this regard. Such developments can have implications for the further regulation and potential litigation risks for businesses. And there are also other examples of specific actions that businesses can take to recognize and enable the right to a healthy environment. And we're going to hear a lot more about these topics throughout the panel discussion. So this is an appropriate time for me to say, please join me in welcoming the stellar lineup of speakers we have to discuss these issues. We have 4 speakers in person, and we have 1 speaker joining us online. So to my left, we have Pachoy Labong, who is the Southeast Asia Program Manager and representative of the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. He's responsible for research and outreach in Southeast Asian region, and he's also a human rights lawyer and advocate. We also have, next to him, Dr. June Rubis, is a Budaya scholar from Sarawak, Malaysian Borneo, with a particular focus on Indigenous environmental advocacy. She is the co-founder and co-director of Building Indigenous Initiatives in Heritage, or BIIH Sarawak. Then we have His Excellency Edmund Bon, who is the representative of Malaysia to the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights and is the current chair of AICHA. We also have Sutikyat Kocheso, who is an environmental and human rights lawyer with 6 years' experience working with NLaw Thai Foundation, or NLaw, and he has special expertise and interests in mining law and the right to public participation and freedom of assembly. And joining us virtually online, we have Virawit Tian Chainan, who is the Executive Director of Greenpeace Southeast Asia, where he oversees the operations and strategic direction for campaigns on climate justice, forest and ocean protection, plastic reduction, and renewable energy across Thailand, Indonesia, Philippines, and Malaysia. So please give my panelists a round of applause. It's an incredible group of speakers. Thank you. Some energy for the last session of the day. So I'm now going to turn to the panelists and I'm going to ask a series of questions. And I first want to ask Edmund, how are the procedural elements of the right to a healthy environment relevant for businesses? These procedural elements that I spoke to, that are rights to information, access to justice, and public participation. Edmund.
Oh, thank you very much. That was fast. Thank you, Georgina. Thank you for inviting me again. How is it relevant for businesses? I think what we have experienced, especially working with different groups where we see negative impacts from environmental projects, is that one, there is very limited access or sometimes impossible nil access to information regarding the projects. And in Malaysia and I think different countries, especially where media freedoms are less pronounced, we have less information. And I think looking at the long-term planning, a lot of different groups have problems knowing what comes ahead. And this happens almost very regularly, where we see projects being done by government without sharing of information. So the limited mandatory sharing of information comes through social practices, through the environmental impact assessment exercises, which is not sufficient. And then on the other hand, without information also, or with or without information also, the public participation in terms of freedom of opinion and expression, expressing dissent over these projects that possibly will bring negative impacts is another form of violation, and that needs to be guaranteed as well, especially protecting human rights defenders, environmental human rights defenders, and groups who want to raise their views against these projects that have negative impacts. I'll just leave it as that.
Thank you. And I mean, this raises a really critical point, because we've heard already in a number of other sessions in the forum already about the rise of SLAP cases, about the criminalization of environmental advocates as well as other human rights advocates. So I guess if we flip this around, what proactive role can businesses play in actually enabling the capacity for affected communities to voice constructive criticism, to voice dissent, to raise concerns, whether it be concerns around the upholding of environmental impact assessment regulations and processes, whether it be around pollution to the environment and others. I think this is a really critical point, and we need to start seeing some more good practices of businesses in this regard. I want to turn to Virawit to ask what thoughts you also have on this point of procedural elements and what businesses can do. Hang on just a second, Virawit. I think we might have a technical issue getting your sound. We can see that you're speaking. We can't hear you in the room.
Yeah.
Oh, there we go. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah. Thank you for the opportunities, and apologies that I cannot be there in person, as I am now in the field in Philippines, visiting our communities and colleagues. So I'd like to maybe build on to what Edmund just said about the right to clean, healthy, and sustainable environment given that we have been working together on this in the ASEAN level for quite a while. But at the same time, what I would like to also to point out is that in these procedural elements of the right to clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, access to information, participation in decision making, access to justice, these are really matter and actually directly related to the business in our regions. Because all of these really matter not only for the business, but for the communities. Because this right about survival, if we look at the communities, that those rights will be able to help them to protect their health, livelihood, and dignities. For business, this is actually about the stabilities and trust, because transparency, participation, accountability, these are not optional. They would help to reduce conflict, prevent costly delay, build credibilities with investor and regulator. Ignoring them will actually bring short-term profit, but in the long run, it will invite resistance, litigation, and reputational loss. But with all the works that we have been doing over the years, I mean, there are some progresses that I would like to maybe show some example so that we have some hope. So like in Philippines, I mean, there's some renewable energy developer who have pilot some community level consultations before building solar or wind farm, which help foster trust and avoid oppositions. In Thailand, we have the forward-looking companies that are publishing real-time emission data ahead of the new PRTR law. In Indonesia, we have prevent mechanisms in the palm oil sector, though far from perfect, but there's just a starting point to give community channels to raise campaign. And we have another big project, which is called Beyond Seafood. This is how we see environmental protection and labor rights inseparables, tackling destructive fishing practices, which also mean ending the exploitation of workers at sea. And by advancing both, Beyond Seafood show that social justice and ecological justice reinforce each other. So these are some of the cases that prove respecting procedural rights is not only possible, but create value for community and business alike. However, there's still gap. A few gaps that I like maybe to point out in this meeting is that first is it too often that data remain hidden from affected communities. And second, consultations could be just tokenistic, large and inaccessible. And across the regions, we have seen that environmental defenders still face harassment and slap suits that silence those who could help business manage risks responsibly. So I'd like to call out on the business that in Southeast Asia is actually one of the most climate vulnerable regions in the world. And we all know this too well to maybe super typhoon, high sea level risings, disrupted agriculture and fisheries, deforestation. All of this for business, we cannot thrive in collapsing ecosystem or destabilize society. Respecting right is not a burden, but it's a resilience and smart business practices. The way forward, I have three priorities that I would like to share with everyone. First, transparency. We have to support mandatory disclosure of pollution and environmental risks. Second, participation. We have to move beyond token consultations, ensure inclusion of women, local languages, marginalized groups. And third, protection. We have to end the reprisal and slap suit and recognize defender as partner in sustainability. So in closing, I'd like to say that growth without rights, justice, and environmental stewardship cannot last. By embedding procedural rights into their operation, not as charity, but as standard practice, business can build the trust and legitimacy they need to thrive. And as Beyond Seafood remind us, protecting ecosystem and protecting workers are two sides of the same coin. The fight against labor exploitation and the fight against environmental destruction must advance together if we are to secure a just and sustainable future. At Greenpeace Southeast Asia, we stand ready to work with communities, governments, and businesses to make the right to clean, healthy, and sustainable environment a lived reality. Thank you. Back to you, Georgie.
Thank you very much, Virawit. I mean, what you were saying about it's smart business to actually embed procedural rights, because if they do not embed this as standard practice, it will indeed potentially lead to investment risk, potential litigation risk, and instability, and erode trust of communities, investors, and also regulators and business and government. Also, I thought it's very interesting what you were saying, Virawit, around the need to have greater access to data for affected communities. And this, I think, is particularly relevant when companies have investors coming in but do not have access to the data about the supply chains or the parent investors of those companies that are coming into those communities. That information is often incredibly hard to access. So having those mandatory disclosures, having effective participation and strong protection mechanisms, as you were saying, to ensure for anti-SLAPP mechanisms and others. Thank you very much, Virawit. And maybe now also turning to June to give some examples, perhaps also from a perspective of Indigenous communities. Over to you, June.
Thank you, Georgina. Hi, everyone. I suppose let's go back and emphasize the right to a clean and healthy and sustainable environment. That's not an abstract idea. We enjoy today clean air, fresh water, healthy ecosystems, largely because of Indigenous peoples who continue living in our territories and carrying out our environmental governance. And I'm not just saying this because I'm an Indigenous person myself from Borneo, but the science is clear. So we see in the IPBES global assessment, it demonstrates that biodiversity, it declines most slowly on lands managed by Indigenous peoples and local communities. The Convention on Biological Diversity has affirmed this repeatedly, especially in Article 8J, which is on traditional knowledge, and more recently on its work on Indigenous and traditional territories. So these recognitions are captured in the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which is adopted by 196 parties. That's 196 countries around the world, which commits states to Indigenous peoples full and effective participation, and that's Target 22, protection of customary lands and resources, resource use, Target 3 and Target 5, and the integration of these commitments into the national biodiversity strategies and action plans, or we call them the MBSAPs. So when we talk about corporate responsibility and the right to a healthy environment, it's essential to recognize that these businesses are operating inside a continuum of obligations with the states. So we heard, yesterday Edmund talked about the national action plans for Malaysia, and there were different countries as well. So these national action plans on business and human rights, I believe they cannot be siloed. They must align with the MBSAPs and the state's biodiversity commitments under the CBD if we're talking about, advancing human right to a clean and healthy and sustainable environment. So when we talk about procedural elements for this, three things come to mind: access to information, participation, and access to justice. These are the guardrails that make this right practical and enforceable. So in businesses in Asia Pacific, these are directly relevant because they share the regulatory and the reputational and operational context in which companies now operate. So the first one, access to information. Information must be timely, accurate, and accessible. So too often it is withheld, delayed, and delivered in technical formats that communities cannot engage with. In a case that I talked about yesterday, in Kudat, Sabah, Malaysia, where women were essentially criminalized because they tried to enter a land that was given to a silica mining company. They were not informed about the environmental and social impacts of silica mining. So women particularly carry out disproportionate burdens, contaminated water, loss of livelihoods, and impacts on health without being able to anticipate or mitigate them. So for businesses, providing accessible information is not charity, it's a legal and moral expectation and reduces litigation and reputational risks. So the second is participation. For Indigenous peoples, participation means self-determination. It means that our governance systems and institutions must be respected. We've heard a lot in the last couple of days about free, prior, informed consent. So this must be upheld in practice. So this requires moving beyond extractive consultation towards genuine co-governance. I talk about co-governance, but when I talk to parties and even Indigenous peoples, people feel really hesitant. But I think if we're coming together as like different parties, different parties, we have to think about how we can work together in the governance perspective. One way forward we also talk about for Indigenous peoples is through direct financing to Indigenous-led institutions, which allows Indigenous peoples to bring our own solutions rather than being passive recipients of corporate plans. So in Asia Pacific, where so many projects overlap with customary lands, respecting this element is critical to preventing conflict and costly project failures. And finally, access to justice. So justice must be available where harms occur, whether through customary laws, local grievance mechanisms, or state and international courts. So in Kudat, Sabah, in the case I just mentioned about the silica mining, the women found grievance processes weak and inaccessible, leaving them without remedy. So businesses that ignore this risk not only escalate community frustration, but also expose themselves to litigation, especially as we see the laws evolving. But I want to also turn the question around. So when we talk about procedural elements for the rights to clean and healthy environment, it's not simply a compliance checklist for businesses. They're fundamentally about recognizing Indigenous peoples as rights holders, not just as stakeholders. So when we talk about right access to information, it means that we have the right to understand and decide what happens to our lands. And that includes also just people, non-Indigenous peoples, right? Communities who are also affected by businesses. Participation, it means that our consent and governance systems must be respected. Access to justice, which means that we must have real avenues for redress when our rights are violated. So without recognizing Indigenous peoples as rights holders, these procedural elements lose their meaning. So for businesses in this region, the relevance of the procedural elements of the rights to clean and healthy environment is twofold. That they are practical guardrails that ensure transparency, equity, and accountability. And more importantly, they are the means by which businesses demonstrate whether they truly recognize Indigenous peoples as rights holders, whose stewardship, science has confirmed, underpins the very right to a healthy environment. So lastly, I just want to say that respecting these elements is not just good practice, it's a necessity for long-term resilience and sustainability, and it opens the door to new models of partnership, as my colleague said in the opening statement this morning, where Indigenous peoples and businesses can co-create solutions for a clean and healthy and sustainable future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jen. Yeah. One of the points that you raised is that it's critical for national action plans on business and human rights to also align with state obligations under multilateral environmental agreements, including the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, but a range of all of the multilateral environmental agreements, including those related to climate and pollution. And indeed, it's very clear, and it's been said, that upholding environmental law is fundamental to enable the right to a healthy environment, but also recognizing the vital role of Indigenous peoples as stewards, as you said, and making sure that businesses respect and promote the rights of Indigenous peoples and have greater awareness of the obligations of states, and making sure that they're not just compliance checklists, as you were saying. So we're going to move from the procedural elements that we have just discussed to looking now at some of the recent developments and updates. We've talked, a number of speakers, both June and Virwit and myself, mentioned about litigation risks of companies. And there have been a number of key court decisions and other developments that are related to the right to a healthy environment and businesses' operating environments and operating practices. So I'm going to turn now to Sutikat to share with us how these dimensions of court decisions and other developments actually influence business practice. Thank you.
Thank you, Georgina. Good afternoon, everyone. So I also apologize for my voice. It's not healthy right now. For the key dimensions of recent court decisions and other important development related to right to a healthy environment, particularly in the case of Thailand, I'm going to start with 2017 Thai Constitution does not expressly recognize the right to a healthy environment, unlike the 1997 and 2007 constitutions. This raises the question, should this right now be considered part of Thailand's constitutional tradition? At the international level, the right to a healthy environment is already recognized as a human right, the key issue in how Thailand should reflect or integrate this into its own legal system. So for the court decisions now show growing reliance on environmental principles such as right to access information, right to public participation, and right to be involved in decision making that other people mentioned earlier. But the court also applied precautionary principle requiring businesses to prevent harm even when there's no full scientific certainty. For example, the PM2.5 case in Chiang Mai Administrative Court last year, the court ruled that the PM2.5 pollution harm the environment, health, society, and the economy. It held that the state must protect citizens by providing effective health services and preventing environmental harm. The court found that the Prime Minister and the National Environmental Board as defendants acted too slowly and ordered them to adopt urgent measures and plans. But the case now it appeared before the Supreme Administrative Court. But this case is a landmark showing judicial recognition of the right to a healthy environment based on both international principles and community rights. And court also stressed transparency. Businesses must openly disclose potential environmental impacts. And another example for the PM2.5 standards and the PRTR case, the citizens sue government agency for failing to update quality standards and implement to PRTR, pollutant release and transfer register that we mentioned earlier. During the case, the state updated the PM2.5 standard in line with WHO target, resolved the part of issue. But for the PRTR, the court ruled the government delay action despite having a plan. But right now, the Ministry of Industry as a defendant has appealed, and the case is pending before the Supreme Administrative Court. At the same time, for the PRTR, over 12,000 citizens petitioned Parliament to introduce a PRTR law. It passed first reading on 5 September this month. Actually, it this month, early this month, and is now under review by an ad hoc parliamentary committee. If approved, it will still need Senate approval. This law would increase transparency, allow public monitoring, and strengthen accountability of both government and businesses. Separately, the Clean Air Bill has already passed the House of Representatives and awaiting Senate approval once enacted. It will create stronger rights and tools to prevent and control air pollution. We have seen these legislative reforms show that even though the Constitution does not currently recognize the right to a healthy environment, but new laws are moving in this direction. This reflects global trends and will push businesses to improve governance and environmental practices. In the long run, reforms at the legislative level could lead a constitutional amendment, bringing back express recognition of the right to a healthy environment as a guiding principle for environmental protection in the broader context, global context. Issues like climate change and transitory pollution means that businesses causing environmental harm risk lawsuits, protests, reputational damage, and loss of social license. And last but not least, at the same time, the recognition of the right to healthy environment continues to grow. However, many businesses that resist change still use slap lawsuits against people, activists, community who speak the truth or defend the public interest, which remains a serious challenge in ASEAN. Yes, this is my perspective. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sutika. I mean, some of the cases that you raise in Thailand, including the PM 2.5 case, really show how litigation in this area can lead to greater regulation of business activity to safeguard the right to a healthy environment, but also importantly, upholding these procedural elements and communities' rights to a healthy environment. And we see through, I mean, if we just look at climate litigation that is brought in the climate space, we see that a vast majority of litigation now that's being brought is being brought through human rights lens, is being brought based on human rights arguments. And I think that really just shows the importance of the right to a healthy environment. We also see through the PRTR law that is progressing in Thailand as well, how this will also uphold the core procedural rights of access to information and enable citizen reporting of pollution. So really critical developments and things that perhaps could also be informative for other countries in the region. I'm now going to turn to Edmund and see if, Edmund, you also want to speak to other key developments. I know you've already spoken quite a bit at the forum about the ASEAN developments that are happening, particularly the upcoming ASEAN Declaration on the right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. What relevance do you think this development would have for businesses operating in the region?
Thank you very much, Georgina. I think for some of you who came in the morning and yesterday, we've been speaking quite a lot on what the Commission has been doing at AICHA on advancing the right to a safe, clean, healthy, sustainable environment. We have ASEAN Human Rights Declaration since 2012, Article 28F. And after 13 years, I think we are going to adopt a second declaration specifically on this right to safe, clean, sustainable environment, healthy environment, and including most of the elements that Georgina has mentioned on substantive and procedural rights. Although it will be a non-legally binding document, ASEAN works in a manner that promotes cooperation in a consultative way. And unlike the EU, we look at soft law as equally important, as equally enforceable in the sense that we have different adaptive protection mechanisms, meaning while we don't have a supranatural court or a commission that ensures effective legal accountability, the methods of cooperation in ASEAN through such a declaration will provide a baseline for us to work on a common framework that includes all these elements, including elements such as what I mentioned just now, freedom of expression and opinion, public participation, recognizing the rights of indigenous people, and importantly, looking at advancing the responsibility of corporates, non-state actors, looking at how they can foster and engage in human rights and environmental rights due diligence to ensure that their businesses do not negatively impact the environment. So this declaration actually aims to try and incorporate as much as possible what the international norms have discussed and have laid out in the advisory opinions in the UN, while also providing some form of ASEAN flavor to it that is comfortable for all 10 ASEAN member states. It is not the end of the journey, but it provides us a framework to create some form of action that we can operationalize with the environmental rights people as well as government officials. I think I wanted just to add that I know whenever we talk about ASEAN, we talk about human rights in terms of very fixed norms, and we talk about international norms as if they are not contested, even in Geneva or New York. But when it comes to countries outside the global north, in the south, I think there needs to be some understanding as to how a lot of human rights norms good as they may be, continue to be contested. And the right to a safe, clean, healthy, sustainable environment is not, if you look at it, the UDHR does not even have that right. But the ASEAN Human Rights Declaration in 2012 already had that right. The point I'm making is that it's not a right that is as established as the right to life, as to prohibition against torture, for example. And therefore, we need to expect that countries in the global south will continue to contest it, especially governments who may be seen as violating those rights. That project to continue advancing this right through a declaration, through a plan of action, through regional cooperation is one part of the work that human rights advocates and environmentalists will have to continue working on, and those groups that and all the experts who are here and in this forum we have to put our heads together as to how we can continue advancing it and how we can progress that right. So I think comparing a lot of what's been going on in different regions, as well as what's going on in the UN, and trying to localize it also needs some context and nuance, where we here as inhabitants of Southeast Asia have our own agency to provide our own flavor towards what that right to safe, clean, healthy, sustainable environment means, and also putting on the table the different debates and different understanding of what due diligence means, what environmental justice means here for the people of this region, as opposed to what it has been traditionally understood in the global north. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Edmund. And you mentioned, you referenced the regional plan of action that would follow after the adoption of the declaration. And indeed, that can be an opportunity to further elaborate through a regional lens and with regional context what these obligations may mean for non-state actors, for businesses and others. So now I'm going to turn to the business perspective, and I'm going to turn to Pochoy to look at how are businesses integrating the right into their responsible business policies, and what further actions can businesses take. What do you?
Thanks, Georgie. I have a few slides to present. Okay, so just a bit of background. So the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, we're actually an international human rights NGO, and we track and monitor human rights and environmental abuse that's linked to businesses and corporations. We're the world's largest information hub on business and human rights, and we do this in 8 languages. So this is in our website, business-humanrights.org. And we have this company response mechanism process, where whenever there are allegations or reports against companies, we reach out to them, we write to them, and bring the allegations to them. And we seek a response from them before we post anything on our website. And we score the response rate of these companies. And that's when usually companies would point to their human rights and environmental policies. And the short answer I would give to you is that there are policies in place. Most companies have policies in place, but they're generally weak, and there's really a huge gap in implementation and practice. So those are some of our flagship briefings, but I'd want to center on our renewable energy benchmark. So environment, the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is really relevant to these companies, this sector. So for this benchmark, we assessed the 28 most powerful players in the renewable energy sector. 19 of them are global and regional wind and solar project developers, and 9 are publicly listed wind turbine and solar panel manufacturers. And here we have a sort of a scoring system. We evaluate their human rights policies based on the UNGPs. And this is our criteria. So just very quickly, just to show a snapshot of our methodology. So yeah, we evaluate the companies based on these indicators, core UNGPs indicators, and I hope you can see that. And these themes as well: indigenous peoples' rights, land and resource rights, and theme I is the right to healthy and clean environment. So we did ask them about their environmental policies, and so from our study, there's been some progress, I would say, because we've been doing this for 4 years now. 3/4 of the top wind and solar project developers have strong human rights policies in place in line with the UNGPs. 2/3 of the project developers and nearly half of the wind turbine and solar panel manufacturers have board level oversight of human rights. All project developers have a grievance mechanism available for workers, just workers. 2/3 of project developers have grievance mechanism available to external stakeholders, and then 8 companies have policies in place specifically to respect the rights of human rights and environmental defenders. So for the right to a clean and healthy environment, so the average score that we assessed is 16%, so very low. So all but 4 project developers disclose undertaking environmental impact assessments. And in terms of life cycle assessments that are undertaken by all, so these are undertaken by manufacturers. However, the transparency around the standards of these assessments. So that's something to follow that we are expecting that they will give in the future. So we also track whether companies have policies in place on indigenous peoples and affected communities' rights. So sadly, 26 out of the 28 companies either do not mention indigenous peoples' rights or have commitments that are not anchored in the UNDRIP, which is sad because these are renewable energy companies. And I'd like to zero in this time on the transition minerals sector. So particularly for Southeast Asia, and we've done electric vehicle nickel supply chain mapping, where we map the supply chain of from the mining of the nickel up to battery manufacturers and to electric vehicle companies. This is the latest one. We've done 2, and yeah. So just very generally, our experience. Of course, we reached out to the companies about, how do they respond to the impacts that are happening in Indonesia and the Philippines, impacts of mining and mineral processing. And yes, usually they point to their human rights and environmental policy, but not a lot of, I would say, concrete measures that can be shared, that are shared by the company. So yeah, I think really businesses have to take a proactive role. I was just talking to someone on the corporate side, that businesses really have to take a more proactive role and really invest in respecting human rights and conduct meaningful consultation, especially when their business operations affect the rights of people and the environment.
Thank you so much, Pachoy. I mean, the evidence is clear, right? You have very clear data and analysis on corporate policies, business policies that clearly show that more needs to be done. I understand. I'm going to excuse City Cat because he has a flight he has to go and catch. So thank you so much, City Cat, for being with us.
Thank you, Jordan, for having me. So I'm very apologize, everyone. Okay, thank you.
No problem. We don't want you to miss the flight. So I'm going to now turn back to June to share with us, what do you think businesses can do more of in this regard? How can businesses do better?
Thank you, Georgina. Oh, I was just wondering, just to pick up on Edmund's point about international rights and then like the ASEAN context. Although I was really glad that you foreground Indigenous rights first. So I know that you weren't talking about Indigenous rights. But his point, I really took his point about the rights to a healthy environment. And I think particularly for the work that we do for Indigenous advocates, we go back to like the basic rights, so that includes Indigenous rights. And I think so much about when we just focus on like the rights, like the basic human rights that we know, perhaps we don't necessarily have to talk about rights to a healthy and clean environment because that would be already implicit. But I think about, so now we see in businesses this we see climate and biodiversity pledges, this net zero, nature positive commitments. We see that as becoming more common. And I think maybe some companies are also linking these pledges to broader human rights frameworks. So these are important steps, but I think often they're also still largely procedural and risk-driven, focus on meeting compliance requirements or satisfying investors' expectations, rather than recognizing basic rights that must be upheld for people and communities. I just realized perhaps in my first intervention, maybe I also went ahead upon what for businesses, but that's great because I can just reiterate my 3 points again. So I mean, when we want to, regardless of whether we see the right to the clean and healthy environment, or respecting that we need this for us to to live in a world that we want to live in, I believe that businesses must move beyond climate policy commitments into more transformative practices. And again, I talk about like recognizing Indigenous peoples as rights holders. And it sounds really basic, but I mean, often when you go to different rooms, have different conversations with people, there's still this perception that Indigenous peoples and communities are beneficiaries. So there's still like this practice that we still have to that these are rights holders, and what it means again is embedding free, prior, informed consent as a minimum standard, and also again I talk about aligning businesses' practices with states' commitments. I'm glad you brought up the climate change, other multilateral frameworks, including pollution, where Indigenous rights are all not optional, but are seen as essential. Again, like how can we have more genuine participation? How can we create more shared decision-making spaces, but also co-responsibility, like it's not responsibility also for corporates. Indigenous peoples we also talk about responsibilities for our communities. So it's integrating these concerns into these spaces and recognizing our governance systems. Again, I always talk about, like practical pathways, direct financing for Indigenous-led institutions. When businesses resource Indigenous peoples directly, you're supporting solutions that are already have been grounded, in generations and lived knowledge that already secure biodiversity and human rights together. And also finally, like how can we embed procedural rights into more due diligence and remedy? I talked about access to information. Businesses must disclose environmental impacts in forms that communities can understand and act upon. Participation, again, like how do we involve Indigenous peoples and communities from the start and not after projects are designed? And access to justice, how can we have grievance mechanisms that are trusted, effective, and where relevant, recognize customary justice systems alongside formal legal channels. My colleague here, Andrew, had this beautiful intervention in the previous panel about that from Indigenous perspective on the grievance mechanisms. So where are we now? Businesses have started to integrate the right to clean and healthy and sustainable environment into their policies. So the next step is clear. Let's align corporate action with global biodiversity and human rights commitments, recognize Indigenous peoples as rights holders, and have direct investment in long-term partnerships with Indigenous-led institutions, so that businesses can start moving from compliance to more true accountability, and for real more transformation. And how can we all contribute meaningfully to a future where these rights that we speak of are not just, spoken in panels like this, but also lived in practice. Thank you.
Thank you so much, June. And I think you mentioned, and also Edmund mentioned, that some of these rights, the right to a healthy environment itself, is actually built on pre-existing recognized rights. I mean, the right to life. We require a healthy environment in order to live. The right to life is very clear. Also, cultural rights, the right to religion, the right to food, the right to water. All of these rights are all interconnected, and the right to a healthy environment really is just building on all of these other fundamental human rights that we have. I wanted to now turn to the room and see if anybody has any questions. Yes, I'm already seeing a few. So please do raise your hand if anyone else would like to. I see 2 questions down here. Anyone else? Would any women? Yes, thank you. Okay, so I'll take first question here and then.
My name is Ashok and I am from India and working with the indigenous community. I have a question to all of panel members. What about the inherent rights of community? Because most of the renewable energy projects are, established on the common land. And like pastoralists, they are losing their grazing rights. Like fisher folk, they are losing their seashore right. So what's about their rights? Another question, like recently mentioned by that right to life with dignity. Here is a point, because in most of in our constitution, right to life with dignity is there, but either it's not protected by authorities or by corporates. So how can corporate responsibility? Another thing, that CSR projects are running, but for whom? Those who are directly affected by the so-called project, they are not getting any benefit of CRC. So these are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we'll take all 3 questions before you respond. Yes, please.
Andrew from the Asian Development Bank. My question is that businesses often argue that, saving the environment is not part of being a business, and that this would come at an extra cost, and that cost will be passed on to consumers. So I guess my question to the panelists is there an appetite to for that to happen? Is there an appetite, given the current economic conditions, are people actually prepared to pay more for environmental protections and human rights compliance? Because businesses have a legitimate concern that all of this extra work comes at a cost, and that cost has to be passed on to the consumer. And so I guess, is there an appetite, particularly in Asia, where the working class are already, there's already a lot of pressure on the working poor. Is there an appetite then to see goods and services more expensive, especially with hyperinflation and so much else going on in the world right now? Is there an appetite for growing levels of inequality? Because if you are paying more, then the less fortunate will also be suffering more. And I guess, from an equity point of view, that's quite a concern.
Thank you, Andrew. Okay.
Hi, I'm Tan from Raoul Wallenberg Institute for Humanitarian Laws and Human Rights. And my questions is, in many contexts, environmental laws are designed to protect ecosystem, but can also unintentionally marginalize indigenous people, especially in my country, Thailand. And by restricting their access to land, resources, or traditional practices, at the same time, conflicts sometimes arise when indigenous livelihoods are perceived as being in tension with conservation goals. From your perspective, and this is to all the panels, what are effective ways forward to reconcile these tensions so that the rights to clean air, healthy and sustainable environment is advanced while also respecting and upholding indigenous people's rights? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for those questions. Can I just check, do we have any questions online? Do we have any comments online? No. Okay. All right. So we will respond to those questions. So I will turn to see if anyone here wants to respond. And Verawit, I'll also turn to you online. Would anyone like to go first?
I think just as 2 points, just in response to the few questions. Thank you for the questions. For me as a lawyer, non-state actors accountability, the face has shifted. You know, in the beginning, we were talking about voluntariness of non-state actors and companies in doing due diligence, in doing environmental um, impact assessments, in doing reporting, in doing grievance mechanisms. We see that does not work anymore. And while there is still a lot of resistance as to whether we should make it mandatory, I think the push now, even in my own country, is to look at mandatory due diligence and mandatory measures, so that as lawyers we are able to take up the cases and make it justiciable in the courts. There's no use even doing binding treaties if the local laws do not provide for avenues for redress. That phase we need to start talking about is what I would call, even in the region, a protection phase. I do not, for my own part at the Commission, I hardly talk about promotion anymore. We talk about protection, and in terms of what needs to be done for legal and laws to be put in place. However, there's still pushback. So I just heard today, even in Germany, the German Supply Chain Act, I think, was downgraded by the new government because there were a lot of complaints about mandatory human rights due diligence. And then I think the second point is the language use. I've written about this many times, and I anticipated this. The language use, SDGs was corporate language, but has human rights elements, environmental justice elements, accountability. And people start talking about ESG. Then people start talking about CSR. And CSR is about giving rise to the indigenous, or giving, you know, free food to children. And then people now talk about then people are talking about business and human rights. And then at the same time, because corporate capture and corporate language talks about ESG, so to what extent people there are different spectrums of activists and advocates, right? So some people would embrace it, some would work within the system, work within the ESG language. And then people look at reporting as a means of trying to make companies more accountable, but that doesn't really work, because reporting a lot of times can amount to greenwashing. So even at the stock exchange and the public listed companies that do a lot of reporting, when you dig down deeper, there are a lot of problems with their reports. So the idea about the language, the idea about how corporate and corporations view human rights through the so-called ESG lens, it's important that we do not forget that a lot of these elements, a lot of the reporting frameworks, a lot of accountants, auditors make money from trying to do reports on that, right? Don't have sufficient robust indicators for human rights. And the cases that we talk about, even today and yesterday, when we talk about these cases, how do we use and leverage on these mechanisms to try and make companies more accountable through that ESG lens? And the ESG lens just does not have the weapons or the ammunition to hold states and non-state actors accountable.
Yes, thank you for the questions. I also have a couple of points. I think, well, the first one, I know, Andrew, you're playing devil's advocate right now. I think we should delink like the costs of doing right to environment to the increasing costs that we see goods today. I mean, because that's a really dangerous argument to make. And I would say, because I also did the last panel I did on certification schemes, we do see consumers who they do want to pay higher prices when they see, that businesses are doing good, or hopefully not just a greenwashing certificate. But we do see an appetite there, and certification schemes are in essence driven because of consumer demands. So, I mean, we can say that there is an appetite, public appetite out there. And the second, and the last question around conservation intentions, well, you happen to be speaking to a conservation biologist who spent like over a decade working, for an international conservation NGO. And that was also my shift towards like indigenous rights, because I felt actually conservation NGOs or mainstream conservation was doing wrong upon communities. And I really appreciate your question, because there's also a lot of evidence out there when we, there's also a lot of evidence out there that the mainstream conservation that we know it actually does more harm to its environment and onto communities. So it's also a change of mindset when we try to understand what communities are doing, the reasons why what communities used to do for generations are not working in today's landscape because of other pressures, of other external drivers that doesn't allow them, for example, to express the conservation that they that have done for like many generations. But there are many cases, particularly like my PhD has looked into it, when you allow communities to continue to live in ancestral territories and to fully express the environmental governance, you already have an existing and successful conservation framework that does not need a lot of money, really, and does not need guards to protect and patrol protected areas, which is also pretty much like a Western-led, adopted into our countries. So much of that is also like, changing mindsets and changing how we view communities. And I know I say this because I've gone through it, I've lived through this. I've worked for over 2 decades into this, and that's why I can really feel strongly about it, because I don't see any other way where we want to progress into a future that we would like to live in. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll try to attempt to answer the second question on whether saving environment is part of business, or are they responsible for that. Not an economist. I don't have like a cost benefit analysis or anything, but we're also seeing the effects that there are costs to not respecting the environment and the rights of people. We're seeing that, and it affects business. For example, in the Philippines, we've essentially cut most of our protected areas and forests, and it's getting back at the cities and the urban areas, and the public is feeling the effects of not respecting the environment, and also even in company operations. We're seeing this, for example, in nickel smelters, where they use coal plants. It affects their employees as well, the health and safety of the employees of nickel processing companies. So there are also costs to not respecting environmental rights. On the last question, I think really, I agree with what June said. That I think the core of it is really FPIC and the right to self-determination. If it's an ancestral domain, ancestral land, we have to consult with communities, indigenous communities, because they know about their ancestral land, their ancestral domains, not even in the physical space, but in the spiritual space. So this is something, and I think there's even the ICCA, the okay, there you go, the indigenous conserved cultural community areas. There you go. So there's actually a recognition that indigenous peoples are the natural keepers of conserved areas, and I think we need to consult with them whenever there are even conservation projects.
Thank you. I want to turn to Virwit online. Virwit, would you like to respond to the questions?
Yes, please. Thank you very much for the questions. It's actually thought-provoking hearing all of those comments, and it could be devil advocate, because I assume that people understand why we do what we do. But just wanted to respond on this, that the reason why Greenpeace exists is because of this, because there have been cases of exploitation of nature, of commodity rights, indigenous people. And Greenpeace, we are there and we are not shying away from making noises, raising awareness on how all of those malpractice happened. And when we talk about the cost, the question is not, can we afford to sacrifice some of the indigenous communities, environments, or nature? But the question should be, can we afford to lose all of them? Because we are living in this ecosystem and the world as it is, we cannot really move away from that. So what Greenpeace does is actually to respond on this, that we are standing with communities and nature. Because if we are just looking at the cost benefit analysis and trying to make everything as cheap as possible at the cost and the sacrifice of the communities, of the indigenous people, of nature and environment, at the end of the day, we will not have any planet to live on because everything will be destroyed just to make some extra bucks of dollars. But at the same time, we are working together with governments, corporates who are willing to make positive change, positive impact. But at the end of the day, it would not be that cheap if the corporates are just looking at trying to save some costs, because as it was mentioned earlier, that we are now looking at ESG reports, and also for Greenpeace, we are willing to have creative confrontation and direct action, which is non-violent, but to bring the issues up to the public and shed the spotlight on where the malpractice happened. So in a way, we should look at the holistic cost of how the business operates, and we could work together in a ways that actually benefit everyone in the long term, not in the short term. So I think I would end it here, that we have to look at how we can actually protect our environment, the people that we live together, and not sacrificing some of our friends and communities and indigenous people just for the sake of making some more profit to the company. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Verawit, and thank you to the responses from all of the panelists. We're reaching the end of the session. You guys have made it to the end of day 2. Well done. I want to also acknowledge, many of these comments and questions are going to continue the discussions across tomorrow. There are a number of other sessions that touch on these topics. I do want to reflect that central to this discussion has been recognition of Indigenous rights, and I think that there needs to be legal recognition of these rights, including in countries that in this region who do not recognize them. And around the points of conservation organizations, just this acknowledgement that traditional conservation measures, in fact, can lead to violations of human rights, communities' rights, Indigenous rights, and indeed impact the environment negatively, has also led to the creation of some core human rights principles for conservation actors and donors. And these were launched at the end of last year by UNEP together with a number of large conservation actors, and there is some uptake now. There is some shift in that community, in the donor community and the large conservation actors as well. But it came at a cost. It took a number of really significant inquiries and recognition of violations for that shift to happen. So I do want to say a huge thank you to Verawit for joining us online from Manila, I think, from the Philippines, and to Sudikat, who is now on his way to the airport, to Edmund, to June, and to Pachoy. Thank you all. My last duty is I have to ask you to please fill out the form about the forum. There's going to be a QR code that will be shown, and so please do scan the QR code and give us feedback on the forum so far. Thank you all, and we'll see you tomorrow.